So how many of you operate chainsaws, say, in the past 60 days? Everybody, or? But I guess my name is Tim Ard. My wife Laura and I, we travel around the country, kind of sea to shining sea. We have Forest Applications Training Incorporated, and more or less all I do is chainsaw. And so we work with a lot of city, county, state, tree care, logging, disaster cleanup groups, about anybody who operates one. And y'all have a full-time tree crew? All right. And you have a lot of work, I guess, with different tree cleanup and that kind of stuff after storms, wind, that kind of thing. And I guess everybody may have the opportunity to operate a chainsaw should there be a big enough windstorm. And so that's kind of what today's about. How many of you cut firewood? Anybody? Very good. So, it's about the same stuff, cutting firewood, as it is to be out and work on the storm stuff. Today we're gonna kind of review probably a lot for a lot of you, looking at personal protective equipment, what's important there. We would take a look at reactive forces on the chainsaw, a little bit on sharpening. Take a look at a thing I call reduced downtime, which is more or less maintenance on the saws. And then we're going to look at a couple of planting processes on standing trees and then also on horizontal trees. I call them horizontal. That's the ones that's flat, right? Yeah. More or less, a couple questions for you to start off with. What is an accident? How would you explain it to somebody? If we're going to try to keep accidents from taking place, probably a good idea to kind of define it a little bit. How would you explain it? We've had a great week so far here in South Carolina. We started off up in Clemson with a group up there at the university at the South Carolina LTAP office. And then we, yesterday, we're in Greenville, South Carolina with the Public Works Department. And I'm going to tell you, I've never seen a facility like that. It is absolutely huge. I didn't get a chance to do a lot of filming at it. We got a couple pictures I'll post. But it's amazing. The group, we had about 25. We went over to a new building they've acquired and had a couple sweet gum trees to take down in front of it. So we did that, and I've got some audio I'm going to post of it. I got a little bit of video, but it's pretty good week so far. But the storms are coming in. We're down in Eastover, South Carolina now, and we got a pine tree to take down. Nice big dead pine tree. But the Ian storm is coming this way, so I don't know how much we'll get done today. It's supposed to get pretty rough around here by noon, but we'll see how it goes. We're waiting on guys to get here. They should be opening up the gates soon, and we'll get started. In case another gust of wind comes up, it kind of keeps it stabilized so they cut the back off. What is an accident? How would you explain it to somebody? If we're going to try to keep accidents from taking place, probably a good idea to kind of define it a little bit. How would you explain it? It's something we don't expect to happen, isn't it? Unintentional, something that we don't expect to happen. One guy shared with me that it's an unplanned event. And that always kind of stuck with me. So if it's something that we don't expect to happen or it's an unplanned event, probably the best thing we can do is either expect them, right, that it's possible, and then the other thing is to kind of try to plan around it, right? And so that's kind of accident. Second question, maybe a little bit tougher, you know, and I go into a lot of different cities and towns and stuff, and you go into shops a lot of times, they'll have, you know, work safe, be careful, and all this kind of stuff. Got a poster up there, you know, it says safety's number one, you know, 0 workplace incidents in the past 3 weeks or 6 months or 10 years or whatever it might be at that place. But then I get to talking to people, and more or less they say, well, we talk about safety all the time, but we got to get hurried up and do stuff, you know. We don't have a whole lot of time for safety. And I'm trying to figure out, you know, what's the fine line there, you know? You start thinking through it a little bit. Why are attitudes so different about safety, you know? And everybody wants to go home in the evenings, right? With all their toes and fingers and everything else. But, you know, I got to thinking, what is the fine line? And it could be the situation of working safe, you've got to have a job, right? I mean, you can't work safe unless you got a job. And then on the other hand, if you've got a job, you got to work safe because your production will go down. Because that's really the fine line, isn't it? Between safety and production. That's what everybody figures. I've got to do it quick. I got to get it done, but I want to not have any incidents. So that's kind of what today is about. A little bit of planning. So what is safety? How would you explain it? You know, we have safety days, safety weeks, safety months, safety classes, safety picnics, all kinds of different things. How would you explain safety to somebody? Yeah. I was doing a console gas back several years ago. We had a chainsaw there. He said, a week before, you know, we had truck driver training. And the instructor there said that all accidents are preventable. He said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, you're sitting there at a red light, and here comes a truck over the back, and bam, right in the back of you. I mean, how are you gonna keep that from happening? He said, well, you ask him about something like that. I said, what did he say? He said, you should have planned to go another way. I guess there's a lot of truth in that. And if we could plan around everything, if we knew exactly what was going to happen, then we could probably be able to do that, couldn't we? But I want to share with you a little story. It's kind of a little bit long, but I kind of think sets the tone for today. I was in North Carolina. I'd been up in Pennsylvania working for a couple of weeks. It was several years ago, about 94, I guess. They were coming out with the new OSHA standards for logging. And Doug Duncan, he was the head of safety and truck driver training and stuff for the North Carolina Forestry Association. And he put together a thing in a community college there in North Carolina to get about 70 loggers together. They were going to go down through the new PPE requirements and talk about some different cutting issues and stuff. And I'd been up in Pennsylvania working and come back down through. I was the last on the presentation that day at this community college. And I finished up my little talk, and everybody's going out. I'm packing my stuff up, getting ready to go back to Georgia. That time was Hiram, Georgia. And so I'm packing my stuff up. Doug comes walking back in. Everybody's going out. He said, Tim, he said, I heard a lot of good comments coming out about your presentation. I said, well, nobody was asleep, but I didn't hear a whole lot while they was in there, you know. But I guess hopefully they enjoyed it. Oh, yeah, I had a couple of guys don't usually say much. They said it was pretty good. I said, well, that's great. He said, you headed home? I said, yeah, I've been on the road about 2 weeks. I'm ready to head that way. He said, well, before you go, I heard a little story the other day I was going to share with you. You might be able to use. I said, well, that's great. What kind of story, Doug? He said, well, a good safety story. He went on and started telling me, he said, this couple, they had met in the Army. And he and she, every minute they had off duty, they were going hiking or biking or hunting or fishing or something. You know, they really enjoyed the outdoors. And it was getting close to their 6-year term was up, and they decided they had fallen in love. They were going to get married and find a little piece of property, put a little house or cabin on it, and then they were going to kind of retire. And at least till their money ran out, they were going to hunt and fish around the lake there in North Carolina. Sure enough, they got married, got their little cabin built. They started hunting and fishing in the area. About 4 months into it, they had met this group down at a local restaurant. And they'd go in every morning, eat biscuits, drink coffee, sit around, talk about the big fish, the big bucks, and a whole table full of folks sitting there chatting about what happened yesterday and all. He said they'd leave, they'd go out, come back, have a whole new set of stories. He said, a pretty fun group to be around. But he said one morning they were sitting there talking, a terrible storm blew in. Wind, rain, lightning, not a real pretty day. Said one of the guys stood up and said, you know, I think I'm going to go into work today. Said I got a few things to get caught up, and as soon as this weather breaks, I'm going to hit the water. The fish ought to be tearing it up. He said another one stood up and said, yeah, me too. I got some things to get done and finished up around the house. I'll go get that done. As soon as I get that done, I'm going to meet you out there. They ought to be really biting. He said pretty soon he was sitting there by himself. He said, you know, maybe I ought to find me a good part-time job, something to do on these bad weather days at least, put a little extra gas money in the boat. He said, I don't really have that. I'm retired, don't want anything full-time. Maybe something part-time could work. He said, I'm going to look around and see what's out there. So he started asking, looking around next 2 or 3 days, hadn't really come up with anything. And next morning he was sitting there in the restaurant before everybody got there. He was reading through the newspaper, had a little classified ad, said game warden wanted, part-time. He said, that could be pretty good for me. He said, I only want something part-time, that's all I need, because I'm kind of semi-retired here. He said, and plus, in the military, I was law enforcement, I was an MP my whole term. He said, I think we'll go down and talk to him about this. This could work out pretty good. So that was on Wednesday. Thursday morning, got all his paperwork together. He went down, found this guy's desk, laid all his resume out. Looks over just a minute. He said, man, you can start today. He said, you're exactly who I'm looking for. He said, with your background with the military and the law enforcement and hunting and fishing. He said, oh, you want something part-time? That's all I got budget for. He said, man, you can start today. This will work good. He said, well, I hadn't really planned on starting today. He said, I got a little fishing trip planned this weekend. But he said, if you let me start Monday, he said, I think I'll take the job. This sounds pretty good. So they had a good agreement and everything was set up. He went back home, started packing up for his fishing trip. And by Friday morning, he had everything packed up. He said, on the way out of town, he said, I think I'm going to go down and tell my buddies at the restaurant. They're going to be excited for me about this new job. So he pulls in the parking lot. He goes up. Just about the time he started to open the front door, it hit him like a stick up beside the head, though. He said, I didn't think about this. He said, I wonder what my buddies are going to think sitting down to breakfast every morning with the game warden now. He said, they may not want to talk about the big fish and the big bucks. He said, I might really screwed up. I might lose some friends. But he came up with a little plan. He went in, he sat down, waited for just the right moment. He said, folks, got something to share with you today. They said, what is it? He said, well, I got me a good new part-time job. They said, that's awesome. What you going to be doing? He said, well, actually, I'm the new game warden. And everybody just stared at him. He said, now I noticed when you're here at the table breaking the rules, there are people out there hunting and fishing without a license. He said, it's my job to catch them now, and if you just help me, his plan was, he pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. He said, if you just help me, we'll make a list of those I need to go after first. And they all hollered out about the same time, old man Sam. Said this old gentleman always had fresh meat on the table, never had a license in his life. He said, that's the one you got to catch first. But naturally, they had a long list, so he kept writing. Well, to make a long story short, he had his list of folks now. The next 2 or 3 days, he's kind of checking around the lake, seeing where everybody's located. And he'd actually found old Sam's cabin was right across the lake from his. He said, I think I'm going to start off with the big one first. I'm going to go after old Sam first thing in the morning, see if I can surprise him. So he got up early, about 4:30. He goes over, parks his truck. He's watching Sam's cabin. He said about 4:45, the lights come on. He said, old gentleman come out on the porch, had a cup of coffee, stretched a little bit, said just as loud as he could. He said, Mr. Game Warden. He said, no, you out there watching me today? He said, I'm not going anywhere today. He said, come on down. I hadn't met you yet. Let's talk. He said, I can't believe it. He said, I didn't tell a soul. He said, must be one of those guys at the restaurant, though. They know who's on my list. They're calling these people as soon as they see me leave the house, as sure as the world. He got a little bit embarrassed, but he went on down. He met old Sam there on the porch. They started talking about the big fish and the big bucks. He said, really nice old guy. But he said, more got to talking to him. You could tell he knew I was out there. He said, somebody had to call and alert him I was out and about, sure as the world. Well, he left that day a little bit embarrassed. He started asking around, looking around, seeing who this snitch might be, And 2 or 3 days had passed, hadn't really come up with anything. He said, well, maybe it's just a fluke thing. He said, I think we'll see if I can surprise him again in the morning. So he got up early, went over about 5 o'clock. He's watching the cabin again. Old gentleman comes out on the porch. He's right up the hill at him. He said, just as loud as he could, Mr. Game Warden. He said, I know you're out there watching me again today. He said, I'm not going anywhere today either. He said, come on down. I enjoyed your visit the other day. Let's do it again. So embarrassed, he just turned around and left. He said, I got to figure out who this snitch is. Well, another week had passed, and he was sitting there in the restaurant before everybody got there. And this one guy who kind of sit over at the corner table, he came through the door and come walking right over to him. He said, Mr. Game Warden, he said, you know old Sam, don't you? He said, yeah, I met him one time. Why do you ask? And he got thinking, that guy was over there that first day. He could be the snitch. He said, yeah, why do you ask? He said, well, I didn't know if you knew it or not. I'm kind of friends with old Sam's family. He said, oh, really? He's kind of putting 2 and 2 together, He said, really? He said, yeah, they called me yesterday. Said they had to put old Sam in the hospital. Said he's not doing too well at all. Said they really don't expect him to make it. He said, he's up in age and really sick this time. And he said, they called me and said, they didn't think he's going to pull through. He said, he's been talking about you the past couple weeks a lot. He said, he thinks the world of you. He said, you ought to go down and visit with him, make his day. He said, I'll get down this afternoon. So he got down to the hospital that afternoon, found old Sam's room, knocked on the door, went inside. Old Sam's eyes lit up. They started talking about the big fish, the big bucks. He said, really nice old guy, but he doesn't look too good. He said, if he does check out of here the wrong way, he said, I'm never going to figure out who this snitch is. So he said, I think I'm going to ask him, see if he'll help me out. So he said, Mr. Sam, he said, you remember that first day we met? He said, yeah, son, I appreciate you coming by. He said, I got to ask you a question, kind of personal. He said, well, anything, I'll try to answer it. He said, I got to know who called you and told you I was coming to visit you that day. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, somebody had to call. You knew I was out there and stuff. I just got to know. Who is it? He said, son, I don't know if anybody called me. He said, I came back in a few days later and knew I was out there. He said, I didn't come down, but you knew I was out there. I just got to know who called you and alerted you I was out and about. He said, son, I don't know if anybody called. He said, when you came out on the porch, hollered for me both times. He said, somebody had to call you to alert you. He said, son, I don't know if anybody calling me, but as far as hollering off the porch, he said, I start my day that way every morning. Kind of stupid story, isn't it? Believe it or not, I cut about 30 minutes off that thing. I mean, it just kept going on and on and on, you know, and I was trying to be polite like y'all, just listening to it all. And I had all my stuff packed up, ready to head back to Georgia. And then Doug said something to me that kind of stuck with me. He said, now, Tim, that's what safety's all about, isn't it? I said, I guess so, Doug. I don't think I caught on to it till I got in the car. He said, yeah, one thing old man Sam recognized forefront every morning was the opposition was out there somewhere. He said, think about it. How can you ever put it in your planning process to keep those unplanned events from happening if you're not aware of those things that cause them? And that kind of stuck with me. That's really what safety is, isn't it? It's an awareness. All right, so I'm going to work on this side. Y'all need to come around. And y'all might want to back up a little bit out there. Because a lot of times, you know, people don't realize, I was cutting up Pennsylvania a few months ago, dead pine trees out of a park, they hit the ground and stuff was throwing 60 yards back over here to the side, you know? So you got to really watch. These are pretty green. I don't think there's any problem there, but if you got dead trees, you got to really watch. It'll throw stuff all directions. All right, all clear? Place this in. That one's going forward too. Y'all are really long on that one, weren't you? Huh? We didn't mess up the parking lot. So, look at this one now. Hinge broke from the back to the front. That one's still attached. That's one that's uprooted. I do the same basic thing here. I'll get as close as I can to the root ball that's flipped up. I put a face notch in the bottom side of it, start from the top, cut down, allow the root ball to go back to its original position. Then I cut the hinge off of it. And oftentimes I used to take and try to cut the hinge off right here, but every time it'd grab my saw chain because these fibers are bent like this, you know. Well, when they try to go back to the original position, they grab the saw. So what I figured out is, how fast should a chainsaw cut? What did we say this morning? Inch a second, right? So if I've got a 20-inch tree here, how long should it take me to cut through that piece? Like 25 seconds maybe at the most. So it's much better to take 25-inch cut off of there and take it loose than it is to get stuck. Because then you have to get it out. And nothing more frustrating, is it? So we're going to take and cut that loose right there. And then we're going to see if we can hinge this down. It's kind of high to work with, isn't it? All right, watch the dust.
how that's bending back up there? So that's just sitting on that notch. And on this one, it's high. I don't want to try to pull my saw up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a notch on the top, and then I'm going to bore cut through and then lower it down. And I'm probably going to do it here, be a little bit lower, huh? And see if we can lower that down. It may be it's got to go down about 3 inches to the ground there. Once we get that down a little bit, then we'll start working on the limbs. Probably not going to move either way. Probably go that way. Think about it, if I work from this end too, as I start to take pieces off, then basically, you know, I have a movement to get away from them. These things, you really don't have an escape route like you would in felling a tree. If you don't have your tail in the right position, you're probably going to get stuck somewhere or hit. So, very important. I got a lot of pressure coming. Oh, I'm at that. Oh, I see what it is now, in that collar. pull my chain out. We're in pretty good shape. I got about 3 more to cut, huh?
He said, think about it, how can you ever put it in your planning process to keep those unplanned events from happening if you're not aware of those things that cause them? And that kind of stuck with me. That's really what safety is, isn't it? It's an awareness.